ST mute.
Hello, we'll get started in just a moment. We have a number of people logging on right now. I want to give them a chance to get in. In the interest of everybody's time, we will go ahead and get started. I'm Ranger Dorn. I'm the exercise coordinator for the EIS Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's exercise. And I'd like to begin with introducing our CEO, Avi Shanur, who will have some opening comments.
Hello, everyone. I have to say, just to get things started, one of the most difficult aspects for me of these international webinars, in this case an exercise, I have no idea how to greet you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I suppose I could say any of those. There are people here from most time zones around the world, so it's all relevant. And I believe actually our panelists represent a number of time zones worldwide. So thanks everyone for coming here. And thank you very much to the panelists that we have today participating in the exercise. You really collectively and each represent a remarkable capability. Current and former cyber directors, security directors, both national and corporate. And it is a remarkable opportunity to have all of you here together representing global engagement with something which I think we can all agree is a pretty serious situation that we seem to be facing these days. So today's exercise is actually a special event in the EarthEx 2022 family of activities. The Global Cyber and EMP Strike Exercise 2022. We're offering this special event both because given what we're facing as a global society, it's quite relevant, but also because we are now this year rebooting the global EarthEx full-scale exercise, building in far more capability than we've ever had before, and it will go back online next year. But I do have to say, this really is a remarkably timely exercise. The malicious threats that we are seeing, cyber and also unfortunately nuclear, are growing and really to a large degree unprecedented since Cold War days back in the previous century. And something has changed between Cold War days and the last century and where we are today. Today, our society has become truly interdependent. Our industrial world, all of the industrial capabilities, everything that sustains our populations is interconnected and interdependent on a global scale, and that brings with it risks that we have never seen before. I think what it comes down to is that if we are going as a global society, if we're going to successfully find a way to address these threats, of course, the natural hazards that are out there, but in terms of today's discussion, the risk of having some extremely serious malicious events take place. It's going to take a level of collaboration which has rarely been seen in the world. I think just to set things off in a rather positive way, there are some very encouraging signs. The global level of participation and concern in regard to climate change, I think, is truly remarkable. We have important national adversaries jointly agreeing that this is something that the global community, that all nations need to come together to work on. On a somewhat more limited scale, in response to the war in Ukraine, NATO is now spreading a network of serious activity and very positive effort all across Europe and beyond. I think there are a lot of positive signs, but it is going to take a level of collaboration in this area as well. I think what we sometimes forget or don't really pay attention to, yes, issues like climate change and all of the related environmental issues speak to the world which we all depend on, the natural world. But there is this layer we have placed on top of that world of our industrial society and sustaining that, which means sustaining our civilization, is also absolutely critical. Less attention has been paid to that. And we're very hopeful that this event today can help to encourage collaboration in that regard. As we go through the webinar, chat is open. Please ask whatever questions you have, make any comments that seem relevant to you. We will be monitoring all of those, and wherever possible, we'll feed those into panelists, and we will get responses to everyone either in real time or after the webinar. But that's very, very important. I think everyone's personal participation in thinking through what needs to be done to prepare for the potential of having these extreme malicious events is going to be critical. If you have an important role in a corporation, corporations have been struggling to find ways to engage with hazards on this scale. The same is true for government agencies, as many of the panelists will be able to speak to directly. Even for those people who don't have a corporate or government position where they can exert some leadership, simply direct involvement and making this an issue that you talk about among your friends and connections is going to be important if our society, our civilization is going to engage with this. Just one final comment, the Electric Infrastructure Security Council. So we do focus on hosting capability, addressing hazards and serious events on all scales, but with special attention to the most extreme events, because unfortunately, those have not yet risen to the level that they get the same class of attention that many, many corporations have found themselves forced to provide to more limited events. In that regard, we are now hosting something new. It's called the Human Continuity Project. You can get more information about this from our website or writing to us, but it involves collaboration of some of the premier research institutions and academic institutions all around the world, participation soon, we believe, on every continent, to collaborate together on trying to put together capabilities, not research for the sake of research, but research and actual development and deployment of capabilities that each of our nations are going to need before an extreme cyber attack or a EMP tipped nuclear attack occurs. So we'll be happy to hear from you if you're interested in that, but please speak out during this event, engage in chat, let us know what you're thinking. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Chris Beck. Dr. Beck is our chief scientist and vice president for policy with a special background in EMP and a long history in dealing with the strategic issues that we will be discussing today. Chris?
Thanks, Avi, and let me thank everyone for being here. You're registered for the webinar. You know that we have an extremely impressive cadre of experts here that we're going to go through this exercise and discussion with. I will just go through and read name and title at this point. The bios of these guys, it would take the whole time just to run through all of their accomplishments. So, but additional information is on the website, and I'll just ask for, at this point for folks to just kind of raise their hand as I go through. But in no particular order, Bob Kolasky, who is the former director of the National Risk Management Agency at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and is now the senior vice president for critical infrastructure at Exiger. Welcome, Bob. Yossi Schneck is the former chief cyber officer and chief information officer for Israel Electric Corporation. Yuri Rosega is the chief information security officer at NL Group in Italy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for being here. Esti Peshin is the general manager of the cyber division at the Israeli Aircraft Industries. Welcome, Esti. Clinton Firth is a partner for global cybersecurity and energy industry leadership at Ernst & Young in the United Arab Emirates. Welcome, Clinton. Good to see you again. Our old friend and colleague, Lord James Arbuthnot from the House of Lords. He was the former chair of the Parliamentary Defense Select Committee in the UK. Finally, Yigal Yuna, former head of INCA, the Israeli National Cyber Authority. Thank you for being here. We may be joined by Rajesh Garg, who is the executive vice president and chief digital officer for Yata in India. I believe, Ranger, we want to then move in to begin. Go ahead, Ranger, and kind of set the stage for our scenario here, and then we'll start with the discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of run through the process we're going to do here today. We're going to introduce a scenario that is ripped from the headlines, the words that are coming out of world leaders, things that Avi referred to here recently. And we're going to present in a video format. Then the panelists will receive a small set of questions after the first video. Then we're going to refine the scenario a bit with another video. The panelists will receive more questions, and we'll take them through discussions, cross discussions, and so on until we've kind of exhausted each one of the four primary questions here. Then we're going to be capturing from chat questions from all of you. I see some questions already in there. We're capturing those. We're going to answer those at the end. If you have them directed to a particular person, please put their name in if you would like them to answer.
I see Ranger kind of froze up there for a second, so I'm going to go ahead and get the scenario rolling.
Real concern this morning over reports of 2 nuclear explosions that occurred at approximately 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, about 20 miles into the upper atmosphere over both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. It is unclear if it was some sort of military test or a failed missile attack. Explosions were reported about 350 miles offshore on both sides of the U.S. mainland. One explosion southwest of San Diego, the other east of Florida. No indication as to who launched them. No one has claimed responsibility at this point. We are waiting for more information and government confirmation, and we will provide updates when we get them. NWS breaking news. Power and communications have shut down the island of Bermuda, apparently due to this morning's nuclear explosion over the Atlantic.
Lights are off here in Bermuda. The power outage has knocked out communications across the island. Tourists have begun to look for ways to get home. But with the Bermuda airport closed, many people stuck here with no idea what the future holds.
Still in shock from yesterday's disturbing events, this morning, people across the United States and around the globe found this on their computer screens. Besides this ransomware attack, a number of targeted cyber attacks, including attacks on major global landmarks. Last night, the lights on the Statue of Liberty blinked on and off. In Times Square, outdoor screens showed flashing skull and crossbones images. Also, lights went out on Big Ben in London and on the Eiffel Tower.
We have been asked to activate the BSX emergency communication system by a number of emergency authorities based on concerns of international instability. Starting last night, a wave of ransomware attacks have been hitting organizations with weaker cybersecurity in a number of locations that includes critical lifeline utilities. Now, while directed attacks have been mostly limited to national icons, the nature of these attacks is worrisome. The technology used was able to bypass some very secure systems.
Okay, we've now heard the scenario. I hope everyone had a chance to absorb that. I want to start with Bob Kolasky. Just a top level question. What is the most important consideration right now if you're hearing this information for your organization? And that can be both your former position or this one. I think probably both would be informative.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Chris, it's, we're literally in the fog of war right now, right? So it's information. It is making sure that, channels have been established to get the best information about what's going on. And at this point, the degradation of the functions of things that we're relying on to do business, the things that the government's relying on to communicate, that's also just an exercise. You've got to assume, right, without power, without comms, you either need to hopefully have a backup plan in place to reestablish ways to communicate and what mechanisms by which you're going to communicate. As a private company, at this point, we're looking for the government for best available information. And that's, and what I'm concerned about with the government is in governments, first of all, there's uncertainty there. Second of all, there's degradation of essential functions on the government side. So how are they communicating? Are the tech systems up, the communication systems in doing that? The citizenry and the workforce, of course, is affected in these incidents. So not only do we as emergency managers, as risk managers, have to be working about what we can do to support managing the incidents, we've got to deal with a workforce that's degraded. So and you guys did this intentionally. We are in the middle of absolute chaos. We're establishing battle rhythm, getting best available information, and making sure the basics of communications are in place to stabilize at least the ability to support some opportunity at response is where I'm focused right now.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Bob. Yigal, can we get your perspective on that? Where you've just heard it's fog of war. This has just happened. What are you looking to find out? Who are you looking to talk to?
Well, as Bob mentioned, it's like-minded countries. We do the same basic things. Containment, make sure that whatever hit us and is still under the foggy, there is not expanding or not getting anywhere else than it already hit. So disconnecting and moving to isolation and things that may have impact by themselves on the functionality of many systems, but keep the pandemic little slower in expansion. And second, of course, is in making sure that backups and the things that needed for critical for continuity, for business continuity, for functionality are mainly operated. No dealing with the perpetrators or who is behind it or attribution. It's not for this stage. It's now for staying above the water and keep on breathing and the pulse on.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Esti Peshin, your impressions when you see this scenario, and does your recommendations or thoughts align with Bob and Yigal's?
Yeah, so first, very impressive scenario. And I think the perspective I'd like to offer is maybe going a little bit back in time. So once this scenario happened, I think the best thing you can do is actually containment activities, try to avoid a widespread of the pandemic, so to speak, if I'll use Yigal's word. But I think the main question we should ask ourselves, especially in this forum, is how could we have prevented this scenario? And here I'd like to offer a perspective of cyber resilience in lieu of cybersecurity. I'm speaking about the cyber perspective and not about the EMP perspective, but since the scenario involved quite a bit of ransomware, then I think it's important to understand the cyber aspect here. Now, initially, the paradigm that we followed was, okay, let's identify the critical assets, the critical infrastructures, and protect them, throw a lot of protection at them, and try to avoid a severe attack against them, to mitigate a potential attack against them. But this approach was proven ineffective because the attackers are constantly gaining ground, and they're gaining ground faster than the defenders are gaining ground. So then the second approach was a risk mitigation approach. Okay, so let's try to understand where the risks reside and mitigate the risks as much as possible. But again, the attackers are gaining ground. I mean, who would have thought 2 years ago that ransomware would be such an issue?
Right.
So today, the paradigm that we are preaching is a paradigm of resilience. Take into account that the attack will happen and have in place the playbooks, the procedures, the backups, and the tools that will allow you to recover from the attack as fast as possible and with minimal damage. Resilience on its own is insufficient. You would need also an ecosystem resilience, because in some cases, a cyber attack against a certain entity would impact not only this entity, but other entities that are tied to this as part of the overall supply chain. So that would be my approach here, cyber resilience.
Excellent. Thank you, Esti. And we are going to come back to and dig in a little bit deeper on those types of mitigations and pre-event preparations a little bit later in the discussion. But sticking with the scenario where we're at in this early stage, let me go to Yossi. Fog of war time. What are you looking to do? What are your first moves? What are your second moves? You still have your mic muted, Yossi.
Okay, now I hope you hear me now. Okay, so I fully agree with Bob and Yigal. Actually, in the first stages, the main thing is actually containment, taking steps actually to reduce the ability to the spread of the damage. So different things, Yigal mentioned it, like isolation steps and different steps. If I can say from the point of a utility of a critical company, or one of the things that is the first priority we are actually trying to do is trying to see and to keep care about the safety of the people, of the employees, and of the citizens and anywhere. So this is one. And the main thing is actually trying to get as much as possible information to draw the real picture, to decide what steps should be taken. And even though if we are prepared, you still have to decide what steps you should use in this situation to do. And as this is a very critical, a very chaotic scenario. We are far away a little bit from the point where the EMP effect take place. So maybe we are not influenced in Israel with EMP, but still those that are. So you have EMP together with cyber attack, really causing a problem.
Let me go to Clinton. Is the fact that this is a scenario that has an EMP and a cyber component of particular note?
I think so. Look, I think the amplification of the two are quite significant, right? Because you'll be looking at potentially a cyber attack. You may still have comms and comms available. We see some of the chats talking about the satellites, etc. So you're going to have this multiplier effect, right? And anything that some of the other panelists talked about was this fog of war. You are in war right now at the moment, and I would argue that hardly any real enterprise has gone through a scenario such as this, such an area. Maybe they look at a ransomware attack, maybe they look at this, maybe look at that, but not holistically as you go above. So you'll be really fighting for information right now, fighting for information about what's happening, reaching out to various entities, governments, reaching out to your people. I think that, I think Yossi mentioned it before, the people are key. I mean, if you can't get your people in there or you can't communicate with them, they'll be stressed as well, quite significantly. So how are you going to deal with this people problem from there in the communications? And I think the other thing to just sort of note is around the sort of safety of critical national infrastructure systems or critical systems as well. If you look at things, in the energy field where I'm from, you've got certainly, operational technology systems and safety systems, right, that are in these places as well. So you're going to have to really prioritize very quickly, establish an alternative means of comms. You're going to have to really sort of rally around to identify people from there as well, and how you're going to get those right people in, communication back to the government as well to get these scenarios about what's happening, and importantly, look at the criticality of your things like your safety systems, be it from a cyber part or be it from the EMP part.
Thank you, Clinton. James, building on this, I think looking at it in a more global context, like we did hear from Bob and Yigal, in some sense, this is what we need to do is stay above water at this point. We're in survival mode. There's a lot of confusion, but from your perspective, especially sitting on the defense committee and others, are you also thinking, is this clearly an act of war? Are some immediate next steps? How does this affect NATO, et cetera? Just to feed on that, but any other insights, James, would be welcome.
Yeah. Well, a nuclear explosion implies an act of war, but the phrase "act of war" implies the involvement of a state, and at the moment, in this scenario, we haven't yet got any attribution. We don't know where this is coming from, and an act by a terrorist group. Well, what do we say? ISIS has declared war. It doesn't really mean very much. I want to go back to a point that Clinton made, which is that we do seem at this stage of the scenario to have some comms, and in that respect, we're lucky. Let's suppose, though, that we weren't so lucky. What we must, having got these communications still available to us, what we must ensure is that all our organizations, while we have the communications, have got a template of where they need to be, what they need to be doing in the event that communications go down, so that there is not the panic that arises out of nobody being able to tell anybody what's going on and where they ought to be, what they ought to be doing, how they ought to be looking after their own loved ones and keeping the show on the road. At the moment, we're not at that panic station, so let's take advantage of the fact that we're not.
James, we always appreciate the British stiff upper lip. So we've had an EMP and a cyber attack, and James says, well, at least we've got some communications. It could be worse. So we appreciate that, James. Yuri, your thoughts, please.
It's quite difficult to add more information on the great messages from my colleagues here. Absolutely, I agree with the proposal they brought at the table. In particular, I would like to highlight the importance of two already highlighted messages, the ecosystem preparation, as they already mentioned, the importance to prepare not only the single company, the single operator. The more we get attention to the value chain, the more we see that it is our world is interconnected, and all processes are managed by stakeholders and organizations that need to be part of a prepared ecosystem. Any kind of event needs to be faced with, of course, technology that will, for sure, is important to do as much as possible to prevent the event. But we also have to consider that we cannot reduce the possibility to zero. So we have to work on resilience to start from the point of view that something can happen. So we have to train people, the organization, we have to invest in technology, but most of all, we have to invest in people preparation, so processes. They are really important. Otherwise, you could waste the technology you are in place because people are not trained to do what is needed in a not common event, not an extraordinary event. Another thought is we don't make the mistake to think that only the big one is our problem. In reality, in particular in cyberspace, we have dozens of events a day. And so we have to think that maybe also possible a major event, but it's really important to organize this ecosystem to face a really increasing number of events that at the end of the story, it's part of the training. So if you are correctly addressing and fixing what is going on in a regular incident, in a more common incident, maybe your people is more able to also act in case of a major incident. So I think that we have to invest on people preparation, process preparation, and of course, technology. We need technology in cyberspace, of course. We need to protect also primary technologies in case of an EMP strike. Of course, no one really know the effect of an EMP on the actual situation of the networks, because we also have to remind all of us that during years the new technologies in generation created a free of charge reliability, because actually on energy generation we have more distributed generation. This could be useful in terms of resilience, because you have few single point of failure, but you need more capability to organize, orchestrate different assets. So something is moving on digital. So, but by a paradox, in the future we will have a more relevance from cyber resilience than the primary technology shielding. No, just to propose some stuff.
Thank you. You pulled a lot of threads together there. We will come back, as I noted earlier, to SD, that we'll come back to some recommended mitigations and solutions. but I really appreciated the point that the way you phrased it is the entire ecosystem. Our EIS Council's term of art is the meta grid, that all of these interconnected and interdependent critical infrastructures, the effects are very complex. And so it's not just discrete actions within a sector. There has to be an overall planning and understanding of how these impact each other. So that is Ranger. I just want to double check. I think we're at the point of a little more information, the second inject.
Yes, let's go ahead. And before we move on to question 2, we will do this. Sorry for my computer problems earlier. Windows 10 versus Windows 11 is not going well. I would like to introduce the cascading consequences. A number of you have referred to this in chat. We also believe that is the next consideration. So with that, Chris, please play the video. This will give us some of the cascading consequences of the events that have already happened.
This thing is beginning to look more serious than just a conventional ransomware attack. Intermittent power outages across most of the regions of US, Europe, Asia. There have been sporadic outages at communications networks, cell phone service, spotty in many areas.
To give you a sense of how this event is affecting major cities, this natural gas drying plant's control systems were attacked, causing the facility to cease operations. That caused a number of power grid regions to go down, including a chemical plant here, whose backup generator failed to operate a chemical refrigeration unit, causing a minor explosion and a fire to break out.
We are seeing heavy disruptions to standard communications at this point. Information available to the public is becoming more and more limited. A number of major internet cloud providers have been attacked, causing retrieval disruptions, site slowdowns, and data loss for many users. And we are now seeing attacks around the world on nearly all critical lifeline networks. In some countries, the developing financial crisis is more serious than in others. Here is a UK news broadcast.
Because most banks, financial services, and insurance companies are closed, many companies can't pay employees and commodity distribution has slowed substantially. The government is planning to meet with EU and Asian finance ministries and banks to explore options for emergency financial mechanisms. It's a mostly cash economy in the UK at this point, and with banks closed, people's supplies of cash are dwindling.
All right, so we're seeing impacts around the world. We're seeing different sectors being impacted. I think all of you have probably gamed a number of these out, but this just isn't about the start of the cyber attack. It's about all the things that are now interconnected and what happens because of that. With that, I'll turn it back over to Chris for our second question.
Okay, thanks very much, Ranger. So right, moving into the impacts and the consequences, I think I'll start with Yossi. So what are the consequences that you're expecting to see if this situation can't be corrected quickly? I mean, so we've gotten to the first, there was some confusion, initial fog of war, but now you're trying to figure out and deal with what kind of consequences you see. I'll leave that as an open question to you, Yossi.
Okay, so actually, first of all, you know, the level of consequences in such a I would say tremendous event is actually very dependent on the location and the geographical and geopolitical location and everything. But generally, if I'm taking in account, so first of all, the critical infrastructure, starting with electricity, but not only electricity, communications, and water, and later on, you know, when you define that it takes a lot of time, we should define what time it takes. But if we are talking about weeks or days or weeks or even more, so all those things are becoming, those consequences are critical because you cannot actually fight. So from my point of view, actually the level of the criticality is dependent, as I say, according to different things. For example, if I'm looking at Israel, And on the electric supply, Israel is an electrical island. So actually, we don't have any other backup from states that may be, or countries that may be less affected and try to support us. So one of the things that in such a case you should do is to try to recover as quick as possible from the total black sky or black outage or total outage of electricity, because electricity is actually core for almost any other life processes in today's life. So this is the one thing. You said, Chris, that we will talk about the different activities that we should take actually to prepare ourselves for it. So I will be happy to talk about it. But those consequences in such a situation are critical. So it starts with lack of different basic things for life processes. I think Clinton already mentioned it also. It starts with problems or dilemmas that have single persons that have to fulfill some duties in such a situation, but on the other hand, they are obliged also to their families. So it starts again different things. And the last thing is actually the supply chain. You know, any industry, any critical industry is dependent on a lot of additional entities that are actually supplying different services or materials to enable us to continue to operate. And those are actually usually also out of order or damaged. So all those consequences are creating a situation that, again, we will talk about it maybe later, but if you are not prepared and not do, actually it's catastrophic.
Excellent. Thank you, Yossi. I want to go to Esti. When you're looking at what you think the consequences would be for your sector, for your industry, what are you most concerned about at this point? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think there are several severe consequences that can impact industry, and I'll speak about industry as a whole, not specifically about mine, because I think it applies everywhere. So first, we are seeing here a situation of chaos. So actual elements within the daily life are inoperational. The second thing we are seeing here in the scenario is confusion. So it seems, and Yossi spoke a lot about preparedness, it seems that the country is unprepared. It doesn't really know what needs to be done in order to mitigate the situation that it reached. And the third thing we're seeing here is a direct impact on the critical infrastructures. Now, we are highly reliant on our critical infrastructures. Industry is highly reliant on critical infrastructures. We need our electricity, we need our water, we need our communication. I mean, I don't think there is any organization that can operate today without effective communication. And we are seeing in this scenario that everything is kind of being messed up. Now, the question here, and I know we will speak about mitigation strategies later, so I won't elaborate, but the question here is how prepared we are as an organization to this type of scenario. So there are two approaches here. There's an approach that says, okay, so the government needs to prepare and needs to be able to provide the entire ecosystem with some sort of mitigation strategy that will allow it to recover. But in a sense, this would be like shutting our eyes to the problem, because as an industry, we need to prepare a mitigation strategy of our own. For example, having a backup site outside the country from which we can operate. So the question goes back to preparedness, and Yossi elaborated on this, I think, very, very well. How prepared we are as an industry, we are as an organization, we are as an individual to this type of event. And once it happens, having the courage to execute on this playbook, because you never really know if the situation reached a threshold where you need to act. So usually you act too late. And there are certain countries where we have seen this happen, and we have seen that they have acted upon their playbooks too late and therefore reached, in some cases, irrecoverable situations.
Thank you very much. Bob, I wanted to pick it up with you here. Both Esti and Yossi mentioned supply chain impacts. In the video, we saw that at the tail end, that there was financial impacts, all these kinds of, so we're getting into these mixed complex consequences, and how are at this point you're looking at starting to react to it and try to figure out the scope. What are you planning at this point?
Sure. I mean, a lot of how we think about responding to incidents depends on the idea that there's going to be support that's coming, whether it's support coming from mutual aid agreements, whether it's support coming from emergency managers in government, whether it's support coming from even the National Guard and national security type support. Here, at the scale of the incident, it's hard to imagine that everyone's going to be able to get the support they need from other places, and this includes it internationally, where that there's agreements to help each other, but everyone's going to have to take care of their own national interest to some level here. And so, what the lack of immediate support means is that, and I think there's some of this going on in the chat, that you have to be self-sufficient and operate autonomously, and not assume that somebody's going to help get you back up and things and take care of your immediate needs. FEMA's got an interesting concept of community lifelines, and communities have to be prepared to stabilize their lifelines, and they're gonna have to work at the community level to stabilize those lifeline functions. And it's a lot of the functions that are being captured in the chat in terms of electricity and health and water and things like that. I mean, the health impacts are going to quickly become a crisis here as well, because of people in hospitals, or people relying on care who don't have power, and what are you going to do for the vulnerable populations around this? Is something to think about. And then going back to financial markets, I mean, we're thinking about things that are happening globally and nationally to basically shut down elements of financial markets so that they can operate at their most basic levels, because we're not going to have the sort of real-time liquidity clearing and wholesale payment systems functioning effectively. And so, how are you going to operate in what will quickly become an economic crisis as well? And that's all there. So, you all designed the scenario. There's a lot of bad answers right now, and not a lot of good answers in terms of what to do. Planning, preparedness, as Esti was saying, frameworks in place to start to deal with what's within your own control, I think, is essential. And the last point I will make is, I would anticipate that the information environment, even as information starts to become available, the information environment is going to be sort of contested in this scenario as well. And people are going to have all kinds of different perceptions of what reality is and what's going on. And so even if there was the ability to accurately generate what's going on, there will be alternative sources of facts that are being pushed into the system, and so preparing to operate in a degraded information environment, not just from communications, but also lack of ground truth.
So either unintentional misinformation or intentional disinformation. Probably have to keep an eye on both, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine it's not in your scenario that the adversary is pushing bad information in there, but everyone's going to have their own view of who screwed up and whose fault it is, and everyone's going to have an anecdote, which is the unintentional misinformation. Perhaps disinformation is people just arguing over facts,
right?
Which seems to happen too often.
Right. I know we wanted to get to mitigation strategies for recovery, but if there's anything anyone wants to note right now about consequences you don't think that have been elucidated. yeah, you go.
Yes, Chris, one short comment about the local authorities, not the national ones. We are underestimating or putting too little weight on the local municipalities or for cities and others. They are I think the most critical factors in not just containing but in recovering. That's bring us to the next questions, because they are the daily life circles of most of the population. And we know that in the US, for example, take the example of New York City. They prepared on a local municipal basis under the city of New York into cases of big cyber attacks or digital attacks, such as, because they are much more closer than the federal government, and that works also for smaller Israel. We need to lean more and rely more on the local authorities and bring them to a level that we can rely on.
Great point. So that's government at all levels needs to be involved in noticing that and prioritizing local responders to deal with these kind of national or even international threats. James, I saw that you had your hand up. Glad. Please go ahead.
Let's not forget that the first response to the possibility of power outages, it will be panic buying in the supermarkets, and the shelves will empty very rapidly while there is power to power the cash tills. If the cash tills cannot be powered, then the transactions can't take place. And the consequences of that would be a rapid breakdown of order. If people do not have food for the weekend, then looting will begin. And the governments need to have a prepared response for that. It's always a bad idea for governments to say, please don't panic buy, because nothing persuades a population to panic buy quite as much as a government exhortation not to do it. So there needs to be a prepared response of rationing of food stuff. In the UK, 50% of our food comes from abroad, and most of it is not in the country. It's not on the supermarket shelves, and it's on its way to the United Kingdom. So we have to be prepared for that. We saw with Hurricane Katrina quite how quickly law and order can break down. And so we need to be ready to deal with the natural consequences of shortages of food.
Excellent point. Thank you. And he pointed back to the supply chain and the financial issues. So all of these can certainly exacerbate. So
just one quick point, Chris, just on that.
Yes, sure.
I think, sorry, that's right. I was just going to re-emphasize that, because I sort of wrote down some of the notes about the policing aspect of this as well. But the national response, if we're talking about supply chain, the national and government response, they're going to have to be, they're going to force the priority. Especially around the critical aspects of it. We talked about food, water, health, etc. They're going to have to pretty much step in pretty quickly, because the individuals, the communities, as we said, will have to look after themselves a bit more. The individual enterprises, unfortunately, you're going to get the lowest possible priority unless you're part of critical infrastructure. And I think the allocation, the security that James talked about as well, is going to be absolutely critical. And examples, there's so many examples of what just happened in the pandemic about how all the shortages we had. And that was just on a small scale, really, ultimately, with comms, with things happening, with everything going reasonably okay, other than people not being able to leave their homes. Imagine no power, no water, no fuel, no, then we've got some big problems. And I think the civil disorder is certainly something to be watching out for. And then that supply chain around that as well.
Yeah, I know that, just on a personal note, that, the height of the pandemic, I struck a note that would have been near and dear to James's heart when I was at home with my family, and people were bemoaning the fact that we were stuck at home. And I said, well, hey, at least the power's on, at least the water isn't isn't out, so I think they took my point, but also wished I would shut up about that. Yeah, we have to figure out like what can be done and what, so to prepare for these, I want to quickly talk about, I think I want to get to the discussion with great ideas about pre-event mitigation that I think I heard everyone leaning forward there. And I think we've outlined that the consequences can be pretty bad. I think we're pretty well motivated, but just to take one step where let's say we haven't really done those great ideas yet that you're going to present in our final point of the discussion, the pre-event mitigations. So if you're in this scenario, what are the immediate actions that would need to be taken to respond and try to reduce the consequences, or at least make things survivable in the moment, kind of going on the field with the team you have versus having had some pre-event mitigation? And then we'll get to the really forward-leaning ideas in a minute. I'll start with Yuri. So Yuri, would you like to take a crack at what the, okay.
Okay, perfect. Just a second.
Okay.
A basic stuff. I think that people are more able to deal with emergencies situations than we imagine. We saw these during the pandemic. No? So we have to leverage on this. The point is, starting from the idea that systems are designed in order to allow and manage the possibility to have a fail. So we have to start from the principle that the processes to restore the system and the service are designed, are present, are tested. So we have to do an important and in my opinion critical to achieve objective. People we had to avoid we have to avoid panic in this situation. That is the point. James already highlighted this point. The very dangerous enemy is the panic, because during the panic you lose any kind of chance to reduce the damages. We have to train to contain fake news, because the importance of correct information to communicate is important. When you give people the right information, bad or good they are, the people is able to deal. I'm insisting on the pandemic, because we saw where we had lockdowns in few hours. People were able to face, because information were available. They organized themselves. They were helped by someone else. If you leave the possibility to have panic, this is the problem, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. That's all. Is a matter of preparation on people's side more than in technical arena. Of course, depends the time you are out of service, hours, days, weeks. It's really different.
Yeah, absolutely. The event duration is really important. Thank you, Yuri. Clinton, any thoughts on what can be done sort of in the moment? What would you advise if you had to say, if you were in this scenario and your client or a government that would look to you for advice, what are the things you can do right now in the midst of this scenario?
Yeah, look, I think it's two different levels, right? If you're looking at the sort of enterprise level, it's really going to, if you're not sort of part of what I would again call that sort of critical national infrastructure side, you're going to be pretty much left to sort of fend for yourself to a little bit. I think it's most important that obviously, we look after our people and we do, connect with our employees and people and sort of secure those things and sort of try and give them as much, communication as possible, if that is possible in that scenario. What are you going to do? Are you going, because you don't want to sort of create, again, more sort of panic we were talking about before around that. So that's on that side. I think on the national government side, certainly, the scenarios like this are so sort of, over empowering. And there's things like simple things like the critical node analysis around every single sort of supply chain component through to fuel, through to power, etc. I mean, I was just in Texas actually not that long ago, and they're by themselves off the grid, very similar to Israel. They're actually connected to the rest, right? So the national government needs to look at these sort of areas, look at this critical nodal analysis, and be sort of prepared to say, how are we going to provide sort of comms in this case? How are we going to be able to provide power? How can we do water? What are we going to do for policing? Are we going to deploy the military to provide security, to stop the panic, etc. from there as well? So there's a whole lot of things that I think this is such a significant scenario. Is certainly going to be falling, from a top-down government point of view. But I think I really like that point before about the communities. How do we sort of empower those communities to help themselves stand up as well as they go through?
Thank you. Thanks, Clinton. SD, I know that you were wanting to address this a bit. So you see any nations or organizations that are taking the right step or are more prepared than others? I'd say I'd rather answer the question that way than to say this is a country that's really, that country or company XYZ is really unprepared. Let's look at some positive examples.
Yeah, so I don't want to go into specific examples, but the answer is yes. There are countries that are better prepared and are starting to pursue, and some are pursuing for several years, an approach of cyber resilience. When we're speaking about cyber resilience, I think there are 5 crucial factors that need to be taken into account. Number one, and I think to a certain extent the most important one, is the human factor. Looking at this very interesting discussion, most of the panelists here spoke in one way or another about the human factor. Panic, news, how the public will react, etc. So the way to mitigate this in advance is number one, to make sure that the public isn't the weakest link through which the attacks can materialize. And this is relevant on a personal level, on an enterprise level, on a critical infrastructure level, and on a national level. And number two, make sure that there are enough defenders in place so that once an attack happens, you have the incident response team and the forensics team ready to do whatever is needed in order to understand what happened, determine the countermeasures, deploy the countermeasures, and start the remediation. So training, or as we refer to this, capacity buildup, is extremely important. Number two is to proactively monitor your cyberspace. So vulnerabilities and risks constantly materialize. If you proactively monitor cyberspace and detect these vulnerabilities in advance, and you make sure that they're closed, you will be less susceptible to cyber attacks. So this is a game of proactiveness. Number three, cyber threat intelligence. So the bad guys tend to speak about their plans. This is one of the main things that play to the advantages of the good guys. So if we are able to monitor and identify intentions of the bad guys to cyber attack us, then we can probably mitigate these cyber attacks. And to the best possible extent, these capabilities must be predictive. So trying to identify indicative signals and not a chat where an attacker says, hey, I'm going to attack the Israeli Electric Power Company. Fourth one is information sharing. Now, this one is, I think, a very, very critical one. I think that Yigal can share what Israel has done in this aspect later on, but I think this is a very important line of defense. So cyber attacks don't usually materialize as sort of like a big bang. They usually start with some initial smaller attacks. And if these attacks are detected and the information is shared among the like-minded stakeholders within the country, outside the country, then a broader attack can be prevented. And I really think that you should ask Yigal a little bit more about this, because I think this is a very important aspect. And finally, you need to have in place the operational tools, a SOC, a CERT, an incident response team, a forensics team, in order to be able to handle the cyber attack when it happens. Now, there's a playbook for this. It's not rocket science. I think there are very good best practices today, and they just need to be deployed. Pursue these 5 elements, and you will have a more cyber resilient nation state.
Fantastic, thank you. And Yigal, did you want to follow up on that?
Well, Esti kind of pretty good concluded it, but yes, first of all, proactive. Everyone talked about it. Proactive is maybe the most important thing. If you're waiting for the attack, any kind of attack to happen, then you are already dead. You just don't know it yet. So it's 80% of the efforts, if not 90%, preparedness and proactive measures in a way to find where the holes, where the breaches, where the gaps, and close them or minimize them. Nothing hermetic in cyber in advance. Second, well, not spoken enough about partnerships, kind of what we're doing here. No one can deal with any kind of attack, small, medium, of course, large-scale attacks by himself. Not a single municipality, not a single agency or corporate or country. Not even Israel, which is used to handle many problems by itself because of the nature of connectivity, of digital life, of all the dimensions and aspects that we discussed about the psychology side, the impact side, but mainly because of 2 different attack vectors that we need to face from all around. So you need to build a partnership that not works only on the preparedness and resilience and proactive before the fact, but also a partnership how to assist, even as Yossi Schneck mentioned with the island of isolation of electrical grid. Okay, in other fields, we need to find how we can rely and partner and work with others. Fortunately for Israel, for many attacks happening in at least 2 or 3 years, we are the partners that we're relied on, and we're able to assist to European, to Asian, and even some states in the US in the major attacks, in recovering, in backups, in getting back. And that's what is basically all the like-minded need to do. The good news, the good guys are much better in the community and partnership than the bad guys. And we need to get that even more.
Thank you very much. I want to continue this on into the natural flow, and I think where we've all been trying to get to is to talk about preemptive steps, as you said, Yigal and Esti. Let me just take a moment as one of the people on the panel that is more focused on EMP than cyber, to say that pre-event mitigation for EMP is very critical, and it's much simpler than cyber. I think that the perception that EMP is, because it's not talked about as much, it seems a lot more exotic, and we use computers in our everyday lives, and we don't obviously deal with how nuclear weapons work and day-to-day things. But in the end, an EMP is just a burst of radio waves. and the protection and the radio waves are in a certain frequency and they're in a certain power band, and it's really hard to generate something outside of that. Whereas it's not like a cyber attack where new vulnerabilities are found, really clever payloads are delivered, and new ways to do it. There's just not a lot of wiggle room for EMP, and so just like the basic blocking and tackling of shielding and grounding of just the critical nodes, and then the fact that things there is some good news, which is some of the components are more rugged than one might think from the limited number of popular stories that are out there about EMP, where one happens and it basically knocks out every single piece of electronics on the planet. That's really not the case. And so the pre-event mitigation there is something that there's some movement in the States, other countries. But I just wanted to plug that before we move on, or to start the discussion, because I know most of the rest of them will probably focus on cyber, which rightly so, because there's a lot more to do. And it's a lot more complicated. But I'll pause there and go first to Yossi. Still the microphone muted, Yossi.
If you allow me, Chris, I will connect all those things that we were talking before and today into one idea. First of all, Esti and Igal summarized very well in details different things. So I will try to touch it from another point of view, including EMP. So first of all, from my opinion, and I would say also from opinion of Israel Electric, and I think even from the state, actually it doesn't matter what is the reason that caused at the end of the day and the chaos. The question is how prepared are you to deal with the chaos and everything. And yeah, I agree. You have different steps that are specific or focused to cyber, and specific steps that are, or preparations that are focused to EMP, building different Faraday cages or protections around in our critical things. But the same can happen with hurricanes or any other thing. So if I'm going and connecting it to your question, actually we already said that the principle is preparedness. Now, preparedness is actually, from my point of view, divided into two main streams on domain. One is a technological preparedness. So technological and procedure preparedness. And again, I have to say that there are countries that are much more prepared than other countries. And one of the things that they are actually using different technologies, not only the traditional one, but also the actually technologies that are giving huge advantage to handle such a critical situation. I can give example. For example, unsensitive communication systems that are available today and can be used, that are not disturbed by EMP or any other consequences. For example, in electricity, the new age of new grid, of the smart grid, of microgrids, is enabling actually to create an isolated island. Even though if the whole system is collapsed, you can still provide electricity in specific areas and to do it. So there are a lot of, so one of the preparation is actually to implement different technological and procedural things. But the other thing is actually kind of preparation that is based on training of the people. We talk about the responsibility. Esti said about the responsibility of state and organization. And I am adding also the responsibility of families and the responsibility of individual in such a situation. You have to train for it. So actually the training around those technical procedures and technical solution is something that is very important And I like to quote the US President Dwight D. Eisenhower that say, you know, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And actually, if you actually are prepared, also that all the organizations, state or companies, families, I agree very much with Yigal about municipalities and the local entities. And if I'm not wrong, Chris, I think few days ago, actually there was some new law in the states following presidential order that actually connects between the state and the local municipalities, of course, to coordinate different cyber abilities and so on. So this is the main thing. And just to finalize, actually those two streams are the preparedness from the high level. And then we should actually follow those things that Esti mentioned and Yigal mentioned that should be done in details to be prepared. And if you are not prepared, and now I connect it to your previous question about what you should do immediately. If you are not prepared, you are actually acting according to what we call, or I call, the hero model. So you will have a lot of heroes trying to save the world and the life and everything. And usually, maybe they will locally succeed to do something, but generally they will fail.
Thank you. Good points, Yossi. And thanks for, I've heard that quote 1,000 times and I never knew it was Eisenhower. So I appreciate that. Now I know who it was.
Okay.
I was going to go to Bob, and I saw during Yossi's remarks, Bob, that you were nodding vigorously. I assume you probably want to add on to some of these ideas, because I know you've been looking at a lot of this for a long time about buying down risk, about spreading risk out, and so on. So I'd like your thoughts on these topics.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. And you know that a lot has been said at this point. You know, a lot of what we're talking about is better knowing your own systems and what's crucial. You know, I used to work on identifying critical functions and having data in place to identify critical functions and knowing what your assets are that you care about, including your human capital assets, and having that prioritized as part of a planning exercise. But then it is the leadership, the structure, and the investment necessary to do something to take less risk in your most critical functions and your most critical parts of operating a business. And, you know, making sure in an ideal world, leaders will recognize that there are incentives for preparedness, there's incentives in making investments in resilience, and that's good business, that's good politics. We don't often live in that ideal world, and sometimes what government and the voters and hopefully us as a group of leaders in discipline of resilience can advocate for is that if you have control of purse strings, if you have control of making decisions on what priorities should be, you have to account for preparedness and resilience as part of that. And if you don't, there will be consequences around that. And you know, that's through a variety of levers that can be put in place to create the incentives. And then the last thing I bring to the conversation is that in a scenario like this, innovation is going to be so important. You know, going back to sort of mitigation, there are technical innovations that will enable mitigation, and as societies, we need to be taking advantage of those innovations that largely coming from, you know, private sector and putting those in place. And then we have to allow for innovation on the fly, which means being prepared to get rid of some restrictions that may exist on a blue sky day of how we do business and how we solve problems, because in a black sky day, having the structure to enable innovation, to bring the best capabilities of the innovators to the fight and not just rely on, you know, things that have been already, and we saw this with the vaccine and warp speed and, during the pandemic, we're going to have to bring, you know, the private sector, for lack of a better term, private sector into solving the problems here on the fly. And if there are restrictions in place that make that harder to happen, then it's going to take us longer to bounce back and recover.
Thank you, Bob. I want to keep the focus here, but I want to pause and let Ranger and our team in the background have been monitoring this extremely active chat. So we have a bunch of very smart attendees that are making good comments and questions. So I wanted to let Ranger pose a couple of them while we still have some time. Go ahead, Ranger.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Chris. One of the keys in here is that interaction that we're seeing in the chat. There are a lot of questions, but there are also a number of solutions that were shared. We are recording this. We will make this available, and our intent is that we want to rely on these collaborative efforts to increase resilience. I'm going to pose some of the questions here, and then any of you can pose the answer, whoever knows best. I'll start with one that was proposed by Carrie Bass. How realistic is it to expect that a national electrical failure from an EMP could be recoverable, and in what time frame?
Anyone want to take a crack at that? Oh, go ahead, Yossi.
I try to talk about it. First of all, I don't believe that the total collapse of electrical system in country like US will happen because of EMP. It can be very wide problem, but still not. The second thing, at least until now, many of our electrical systems are still based on electromechanical and connected devices working. So there are less influence by EMP. So two things. First of all, a total loss of electricity to whole US. I don't think it's something that can happen, but it can be very, very significant in large areas. Second thing, partially we would be able to restore in several places electricity pretty fast, but in many places it will take long time, because actually after an EMP attack, if all the damaged equipment and the electronic cars, if they are hurt and everything, should be replaced. You cannot repair them. You should repair them, replace them. So it can take a lot of time. So I would divide it into graduate. Some local points can still, and if you are prepared, still produce electricity and supply electricity to the locality. On the broad and let's say bringing the whole electricity back generally can take a long time.
Yeah, I would say I agree that a nationwide blackout from an EMP is less likely. We do know though that the subcomponents, the three electric grids, we almost had a complete blackout of ERCOT. That's the Texas grid, which is a sort of standalone grid connected to the other ones at a couple of touch points, but that one was pretty close to going out in March of 2021, just because of massive restrictions in fuel caused by temperatures that dropped way below. So it's certainly possible to have an impact across a connected system. James.
One of the issues is if the transformers are damaged, how do we replace them? And the waiting time for those transformers is already very long. But if lots of transformers are damaged at the same time, then that simply isn't the supply chain to replace those transformers across the world. And that's an issue that we have to prepare for, I think.
Agree. Long lead items in the supply chain or without are the key. So even if there isn't widespread, lots of systems affected, when those systems are very they're very specific, and they're large, and they're hard to move around and things like that. So sparing is a challenge. Then you can run into that problem where one loose cog in the machine can take the whole thing down for a while. any other responses for that question? Otherwise, I'll go back to Ranger. Ranger, you have another question or two?
Yes, I have Rock Barassa, who asked, will governments bring key infrastructure owners, mainly in the private sector hands, into the decision-making process, or will it remain the politicians and military realms?
Sure, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the progress that most governments made is the structures are in place and have been exercised to do that already. And while there will, of course, be national security decision making that is only governments and military, for the most part, the private sector will be part of the solutioning going on here in the discussion. I know in the US, that was a lot of what our efforts were to do that, including creating a emergency support function that was intentionally designed to get businesses and supply chain owners in the private sector into the conversations. And so it's now part of the emergency support function structure, in addition to the critical infrastructure structure there. And I think that's really important. And I, you know, in my work internationally, I saw that was happening in a lot of other countries, not just the United States.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone else want to follow up on that question? I think maybe we have time for one more, Ranger, and then we probably better wrap up, but we got 5 minutes. I don't want to go too far into overtime, but
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is from Don Bonacek. When and how would individuals, families, and communities get current true information on what is happening and what should they do? And I think this combines with a number of other questions that related to individuals, families, and your staff that might be out there.
Right, and reliable information. Anyone want to make some comments? Go ahead, James.
The best thing I think that can be done is to follow the Swedish guide, which is available in English, called If Crisis or War Come. And they make it available, they practice it in Sweden, because in Sweden and other countries like Finland, Israel, that regard themselves on the front line of existential attack, they really do take this thing seriously. And so my suggestion is read that leaflet and do what it says.
Fantastic. I will put that on my reading list. Please go ahead, Esti. Esti, your mic is still muted.
Yes, it is. Yeah, so this is actually a very, very good question. And in Israel, the National Cyber Directorate set up a call center. And today it's relatively well known. So when something happens, you wake up in the morning and you encounter a ransomware on your computer, you will probably give a call to this call center. And you will receive initial advice on what to do. Now, this is important for two factors. Number one, it helps the individual handle the situation. So, you know, and they don't come to me because I deal with computers and say, hey, Steve, what should I do? I have a red screen. So this is also a good point. But the second thing, it's a line of defense, because when the National Cyber Directorate sees many of these calls happening simultaneously, they know that something is afoot. So this is an additional way, and we spoke about information sharing, this is an additional way to gain information about the situation and awareness of the nation state. So I think this is a very effective tool, and it should be deployed by other countries globally.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. Yossi, go ahead.
Just a small addition, and I agree very much with Esti, but actually it touches preparedness, because part of the preparedness should be also preparedness, how you actually are able to provide to any entity, if it is individual, families, or organization, a clear and true information. And the condition to do it is actually that those that are actually distributing this information have the information. And to have the information is actually you have to prepare yourself to build an entity. The example is our information system that is created by the INCD, and actually Yigal was the father of it, so he knows it very well. And so it's also part of preparation, how you actually are able to provide reliable information in any situation.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Any closing thought up there? Bob, are you scratching your chin or raising your hand? Okay. So thank you. Ranger, do you have any wrap-up thoughts? And then I'll go to Avi.
Yeah, just a couple. We are going to be sharing the chat along with the video recording, so you'll be able to think of answers and follow up. We will make sure that the polling information is also provided afterwards. I want to thank all of you for being here, both the panelists and the folks who've endured a lot of back and forth discussion, a lot of thoughts, and provided a lot of content. So thank you very much. We have some closing comments from Avi, and with that, I'll turn it over to Avi.
Okay, thanks, Ranger.
Yeah, thank you, Ranger. Thanks, Chris. Thanks so much to the panelists and the outstanding audience participants with a great and very active chat. I think the best summary for me of all the comments that were made, of the discussion by the panelists, Yigal, Una, I love the way you summarized it. If you're not prepared for an event on this scale, you're dead. You simply don't know it yet. I think that's critical. And I think the big problem is that we're all used to preparing for hazards and disasters that occur with some reasonable repetition. The problem is the vulnerabilities we're talking about now come from something new that our society never had before. Very tight interdependencies that span all our sectors, all our nations. That's the reason we haven't seen it yet. We need to find a way to find the motivation for our corporations and our governments to work either both together and separately, even though this does not align precisely with business as usual. We need to find ways to get serious about this, collaborate together. If you are interested, there's a lot of capability at EIS Council. As I mentioned in my introduction, there is a new project called the Human Continuity Project, which is focused on specifically finding a small handful of the critical capabilities, which if widely deployed across all sectors and at least the major nations, could be the difference between recovery and chaotic catastrophe. So it's going to be critical that we find ways to work together, either through participation of your organization in the Human Continuity Project or information on that if you're interested, or through some other venue that you and your organization may be part of. All of us need to find a way to actually get serious about preparing for not simply the kinds of events we're familiar with, but these potentially really severe events. Thanks, Ranger. Thanks again to all the panelists. I believe, is there a final video, Ranger?
Yeah, thanks very much, Avi. I'm going to share that now and with some closing information, but I really want to appreciate everyone's efforts. This is an ongoing event, so this discussion is in some ways the beginning, and we'll follow up with all the great information and questions that we got in the chat. But here's some additional information, as Avi was saying, about next steps.
midst of the pandemic, industry leaders and government officials came together from around the world to discuss the resilience gaps in our critical lifeline utilities. Concerned organizations from all sectors have joined this effort to lay out solutions for both conventional and black sky hazard scenarios. GRCom is creating working groups and hosting international webinars to help build a more resilient world.
So thank you very much. We want you to be involved in GRCom. We want you to be a member of the council. So please visit our website. There you can learn more about membership and our efforts to continue to secure our infrastructures and our societies. Once again, thank you all very much for being here today. Thanks to our panelists and thanks to our fantastic participants on the call and the chat. Thank you all very much. Please have a safe day and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.